Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Happy Hump Day Wednesday. I am Agina Noradine Little, and I am thrilled to be here with you as the newest member of our learning team. I'm so glad you could join us today for the kickoff of our fall learning series. For those who may be new, these sessions are optional spaces where we bring in thought leaders to share their work and perspectives. It's in response to needs we're hearing from our partners or to highlight emerging issues and solutions that could spark ideas across our ecosystem. We've heard from many of you that communication is a big area of focus right now. As leaders across the SpringPoint Partners community, you share some of the challenges you're facing as you navigate an increasingly complex and unpredictable information environment. That's exactly what today's session, the first in our new communication series, is all about. We are thrilled to be joined by Dr. Claire Wardle, a leading expert in misinformation, verification, and user-generated content. You'll find her full bio in the chat, but I'll highlight just a few pieces that I feel especially relevant to today's conversation. Dr. Wardle is an associate professor in the Department of Communication, at Cornell University, and the co-founder of both First Draft and the Information Futures Lab at Brown University. Her groundbreaking work has shaped how organizations like the BBC, the United Nations, and the Council of Europe respond to the challenges of misinformation. Drawing from her extensive research and practical experience, Dr. Wardle will help us unpack the emerging communication challenges we're facing today and provide concrete strategies for navigating the noise, discerning reliable information, and communicating with clarity and confidence. For our time together, Dr. Wardle will share a presentation that includes case studies and interactive questions for you to respond to along the way, as well as Q&A. At the end of her presentation, I'll return with a few final announcements. We'll also share today's materials and additional resources as part of the follow-up. To help us make the most of this session, we encourage you, if you're able to turn on your cameras. Turn on those cameras if you can. Now, please join me in giving a very warm virtual welcome to Dr. Claire Wardle.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for that lovely, lovely welcome. And goodness, that music. I was like trying to be professional, but I really wanted to just shake my head and my booty. Okay, there is nothing better than seeing people on a Zoom of an afternoon when you could be doing something else. So I am very touched that you have decided to spend an hour and a half with us, having hopefully a really useful conversation. And as described, my hope is that you are part of this conversation. I know I sometimes sit on these webinars and I do my emails, but I do think that you're all going to have things to share with each other that will be incredibly valuable. So my hope is to make this more interactive than just something that you could watch or listen to on a 2x speed while walking the dog. My hope is that this actually feels like a learning environment. So as we know from learning environments, we're going to start with an icebreaker, only partly because that's going to help me with some of this. So let me pull up the slides. And I'm going to start with this, which is what I like to call truth or a lie. You may have played this before, but it's helpful, I think, just to let's just lighten the load. We're going to talk about some things today that are a little bit depressing. I love to know if I've got a secret salsa dancer in the audience, or maybe I've got somebody who was a triplet, or somebody who just sometimes has Cheerio for their dinner. I don't care, but I just want to know some things about you, right? So if in the chat you could write something, like, I know some of you have done this, but your name and your role. And it's quite helpful for me to know whether, like, do you do communications or you do something else in the organization? That's helpful for me to know. And my truth or a lie, and I promise I'll tell you, is that I once played the clarinet for the Queen of England. RIP, Your Majesty. So I'm going to stop sharing, but hopefully you can remember that. Name, role, truth or a lie. And if you can put it into chat, we're going to start a waterfall. I just want to see who's on. And maybe I've got that salsa dancer, or maybe I haven't, and you're just going to use it as your lie. And I promise I won't call on you. I just want to see who's on there and what your creative imaginations can do. 76 first cousins. Now that could technically be true. That could be true if you're like one of 11 kids. But I don't know how you remember everybody's birthday if that is true. Okay, Nicolette for kicking us off. Thank you. Who else? Come on, let's just go. Let's put it in the chat. Woo! I sang backup for Josh Groom. I don't care if that's a lie. I really want it to be true. Ooh, the walking globe. Right? See, doesn't everybody now want to believe that this is true? Sky, oh my goodness. If that is true, then that is crazy. I can hardly go down a slide in a playground. Exotic dancer in gay clubs in the 70s. David, I don't care if that's true or false. I love you. A rose song with Madonna. See, this is amazing. Okay, so I'm going to do a few more. Skydiving and bungee jumping. I feel like maybe there's a Venn diagram of people who are connected in this network and heights. Now, Darian, you fluent in four languages. Could be like Pete Buttigieg. Is one of them Norwegian? I twirled baton. I love that. But the Calgary Stampede. This is very North America. Those two things. Okay, so once was in a reality show. But some of my research is on reality shows. Okay, so we have to get on to learning, but I just want to thank you for sharing some of these things. And I'm going to go back to the slides and I'm going to talk about whether or not my truth or lie was true. And here's the thing. I did technically play the clarinet in front of the Queen. I was part of my county youth orchestra back in the day. I played the clarinet, and many, many youth orchestras went to the Royal Albert Hall and the Queen was there. Right. Now, the reason I use that as my example is because that's a lot of what the contemporary information environment is like, right? People are fixated in on is it true, is it false? And actually, most of what we see is what I call false context, right? Which is genuine information used out of context or a kernel of truth, but not the full truth. And so I don't know how many of you really are skydivers or exotic gay dancers, whatever it is. I really hope all of it is true. But often people will be like, I've actually got a lot of first cousins, but not 76, right? So when people ask you to lie, we tend to think of things that we already know for certain, and then we kind of like build from that. So I just wanted to start with this as an icebreaker, but also it's quite helpful to think about this in the context of the contemporary information environment. So in today's session, I want to do three main things, right? This is good pedagogy. I'm going to tell you what I'm going to teach you. I'm going to teach you, and then I'm going to remind you what I just taught. But we're going to explore the characteristics of the contemporary information environment. We're going to learn how this impacts those of you who are particularly thinking about communication right now, both in your own lives and your organization. But then we are going to end by saying, well, what might this mean for your organization? And one thing I'm going to say is you're not going to take everything away from a 90-minute session. Like that's just not possible. It's not how our brains work. What I want this session to do is to get your juices flowing. And if this session just leads to one conversation with one other person at your organization, I have done my work here today, right? All I want to get from today is you going, oh, I hadn't thought about that. That is all I want, right? You cannot pick everything out. You can just, start on the process of awareness building before you get to learning. So part one, I'm going to talk about our contemporary information environment. Then I'm going to talk about this term that you may have heard, but called bespoke realities. And I'm going to talk about the weaponization of our information environment. I wish I didn't have to talk about that, but that is the reality that many of us are working with today. For between 2019 and 2021, I was an executive director of the nonprofit First Draft, and we were helping organizations with misinformation. It will not surprise you that we got targeted, we had lawsuits, and it became increasingly difficult to do our work. And in the end, unfortunately, First Draft closed and we moved to Brown because I needed additional support. Unfortunately, many of us are working on issues where we are becoming targets. And that is often not the case for those of us who started working in the nonprofit sector or academia. But the world has changed. And so we have to be aware of the ways in which the environment through which we do our work is being weaponized. And then I'm going to end with some concrete ideas about the ways that your organization can get prepared for this. I'm not here to scare you. I'm here to say, this is the reality. What should your organization be thinking about tomorrow rather than when something happens? I hope nothing ever happens to your organizations, but I do think all of us have to be prepared, and we can't be naive to, oh, it won't happen to me, because unfortunately, that's no longer the case for many of us. So you don't have to say anything, but I would like you to take 20 seconds to think about just one word or maybe a short phrase that you would use to describe our contemporary information environment. Imagine I was an alien and I've just landed from Mars, And I'm like, oh, tell me, how do I find out things here? What do I do? How do you guys find out information? Where do you go for it? How is it? Is it good or bad here? Think about a word that you would use to describe our contemporary information environment in your head. Okay, and then I would love it if you could go to chat and type in your word or short phrase. Oh, this is great. Difficult, chaotic, volatile, a mess, controlled, toxic, constant, mistrust, messy, chaos. Overwhelming, that's my word for unreliable, toxic, scary. Okay, so I might get back into my spaceship and go back to Mars, but you have described and used lots of words that many people would use to describe our contemporary information environment. So thank you for that. But just to show you this, I did this with my students last week on one of our interactive things. And this were the word and phrases that they use. So very, very similar to yours: overwhelming, polarized, misleading, messy, negative, one-sided, diverse. Just goes to show, even if you're a student that goes to Cornell, you still think it's hilarious to anonymously type the word poop onto the whiteboard. But I think you can see that we were pretty negative there in the ways that we talked about it. And I think what's worth remembering is, in many ways, we were very excited to think about this shift, right? So, in terms of gatekeepers, there used to be a time where a small number of people, often men, often white men, would sit in a room and decide what the news was, right? We had gatekeepers who made decisions about information flow. And then Web 2.0 came along, and all of a sudden, anybody with a story could share that without any gatekeeping. And because of that, we have different stories today. We have different sources. We have people having to issue corrections because they've made mistakes, and now the community can tell them. All of that is great. But unfortunately, we do have a situation that the absence of gatekeepers means that anybody can publish what they want without any editorial oversight, fact checking processes, or adherence to ethical standards. And so there are many good things about that, but there are also negativities. And I think what saddens me when I do this, the thing that I just did with you and what I did with my students, is we all have got to a point now where we think very negatively about our information environment. It still is a wonderful place. The internet makes me do a belly laugh at least 5 times a day. It is extraordinary that we can hear from voices globally in real time, sharing their stories with us. That's incredible. And I don't want us to lose sight of that. The challenge for us today is, how do we recognize these characteristics and navigate it safely? How do we navigate it in a way that our voices can be one of those voices that gets heard, right? So it's this balance that we are constantly searching for. Because the way we consume information has changed. This still happens, and there's nothing like a lovely sitting down sometimes on a Sunday to watch HBO, watching the latest great TV. But this is happening, right? I particularly like the Nana on the pink laptop, but there are now many, many different ways people can access and engage with information. And it's not just the different formats, it's all the different platforms and places, right? Whether it's gaming platforms, anybody who's got a teenager will know that they're spending hours on all sorts of games that I've got no knowledge of. We've got a number of different social networks now. It's not just Facebook and Twitter. There's been this explosion of different social networks and different social networks that actually respond to people's worldviews, right? So we've had a splintering. We have hyper-partisan television news, but we now have hyper-partisan platforms. We now have LLMs. We've now got chatbots to contend with. So, in terms of, if any of you are kind of head of communications, I was head of communications for the UN Refugee Agency in Geneva in 2014. And my job was to tweet about what was happening. I had 1.4 million followers on Twitter, and it was terrifying every time I clicked publish. But I didn't have to worry about TikTok or Instagram or what people were finding if they were searching on LLMs. I didn't have to worry about any of that. And it was still extraordinarily difficult. Doing communications now is like nothing we've ever seen, right? And there are, again, opportunities, but there are real challenges. And so I promise it's not going to be this interactive, but I want to start in a good place, right? So if you have your phone, This is my iPhone, and some of you might also have Android. And with Android, it's called digital well-being. But I would like you to, if you're on an iPhone, go to your settings. And if you scroll down a little bit, you'll see something that says screen time. And again, if it's on Android, it should be called digital well-being. So I just did this morning. And my average this week is 1 hour, 36 minutes. Now, as you can see, it says down 53% from last week, and that's because school started. So I'm now back being very, very busy. And so my scrolling time has gone down. My students' average is 9.5 hours a day, right? So we have big generational shifts in terms of how much people are spending time on their phones. My students double screen, right? They're on their laptops and they're on their phones. They're cleaning their teeth and they're on their phones. They're watching Netflix and they're on their phones. So partly it's so high because they're doing two things at once. So if you're on the screen time thing, it says see all app and website activity, which takes you to the breakdown. As you can see, I spend more time on Blue Sky. I still spend time on X because I want to know what's happening in all areas of the ecosystem. But I am clearly somebody who likes short text-based formats. You do not see TikTok here or YouTube, which if we were looking at this, my student's phone, it's all Instagram and TikTok. 18 minutes on WhatsApp, 26 minutes on the Atlantic. You can tell a lot about a person by looking at their screen time. But I'd love you just to think a little bit and reflect on what would these stats look like if you compared them with maybe your partner or your kids or your parents or your neighbors. My mum scrolls all day long. She is retired. And she is deeply online. So there's a lot about, oh, I'm worried about the kids. I'm also worried about the grandparents, but that's for a different time. But it is fascinating to think about the ways in which we're spending very different amounts of time, but in very different places, right? Because the first thing I want you to take away is that our information environment is splintered. It's no longer the case that if we just put a press release in the right place, everybody's going to see what we want them to see, right? People are spending a lot of time in very, very different spaces, and nobody has identical information experiences, which makes it very hard to study it, which is my job. But it also makes it very hard if you're doing the kind of work you're doing to reach people where they are in formats that make sense to them from messengers that they trust, right? That is the real takeaway from today's session is we have to be where people are using formats that they enjoy from messengers that they trust, right? And doing that and how to resource that, of course, is a huge challenge. And the other thing I just want to stress is that while influencers, and we're going to talk about the term influencers, which I don't like that term because I think if I say influencers, you're all going to think of different things. Some of you will think about Joe Rogan. Some of you will think about local community voices that are very trusted. Some of you will think about a sports celebrity. So the term influencers doesn't really help, but those people who are online influencers, they love video platforms where their content can be passively consumed. But actually, the rest of us are increasingly moving to closed spaces. So whether that's closed Facebook groups, whether that's WhatsApp groups, whether that's family text message threads, actually people are spending more time in closed spaces. So when people talk to me about social media listening dashboards, and we'll talk a little bit about that later, like, oh, we've just invested in this big social listening dashboard. I'm like, well, the people you're listening to are probably not the people that you want to hear from, right? Because the people who talk publicly these days on these platforms are often not the kind of communities that we want to connect to. And the other thing to stress is our information environment encompasses online and offline spaces. There can be too much focus on the platforms, and the platforms have done incredible damage to our information environment. But I think that, particularly academics, we have studied online platforms because we could, and we have ignored really important information places where people are talking and sharing and learning from one another that are offline. And so for many of you working in community spaces, you know how important offline spaces are. It can sometimes get forgotten. So the first thing I stressed was that it's splintered. The second thing I want to stress is that it's networked, right? So I sort of joke, and I've got a slide later, which is too many of us still communicate like it's 1997, right? Before there was a web, we still think about, well, if only I just put somebody behind the podium, I just need to get an op-ed in the local paper. It's very top down, this idea that I've got the information and I just need to disseminate it, right? Even in my line of work, people talk about community engagement. but they're not really engaging. They're just been like, oh, I've got a new research report that I need to tell people about, right? It's very much about broadcast. So if we think about top-down news, on the, numbers released today, well, actually, when that gets received by audiences, what we see now is this very networked way of thinking through that, right? People don't just passively accept, they'll share it with one another, they'll question it, they'll challenge it, they'll do their own research. And so that networked element is fundamental to our information ecosystem. And it's a really powerful part of our information environment. And what I often say is that universities, newsrooms, government agencies, we never actually woke up to what Web 2.0 could do. We go onto Twitter and we say, click our PDF, right? Or we say, tune in at 11. We're not actually listening and talking to people. I spend a lot of time in conspiracy spaces. Those spaces are deeply participatory. People are told to do their own research, to connect with one another, to help out. So I often say, how can trusted spaces, how can we become more participatory? And so because it's networked and participatory, this is what I often say is, I might follow the New York Times on Facebook. I don't think that they're reading my comments. I don't think they're actually listening to what I'm saying. But there are many spaces that truly are participatory and everybody feels that they have a role to play. It doesn't matter where they are hierarchically. Whereas in the spaces that many of us spend time, in order for you to have a voice, for you to write the op-ed, for you to stand behind the podium, you have to have some sense of letters after your name or some kind of, some reason why you should be seen as the person that everybody listens to. Whereas participatory online communities, everybody has a role to play and everybody has a reason to be part of that community. And so people feel heard and they feel like they have a sense of agency. And so this is an example, and I could apologize to the Australian Government Department of Health, but I really could have pulled an example like this from anywhere. This is a 69-page PDF with absolutely no images, just words, 69 pages. Everything is factually correct, but it could not be more dry and it could not be less engaging. On the other side, this is somebody who I found when I was doing work in 2019 on Instagram around anti-vax communities. And as you can see from her t-shirt, she really spends her time reading and she believes that she is informed. She is not my mum sharing something on Facebook without checking. She spends all day long reading science. So we've got these two different places that are thinking about vaccines. The first one, as I said, just words on a page. This is the kind of material that would get shared in an anti-vax community, right? And I'm not saying that Australian Department of Health should be creating more memes, but I just want you to think a little bit about why that image on the right makes you have a reaction, right? You cannot fail to have an emotional reaction to that image. This is not misinformation. This actually is the number of vaccines that many children do have. You just have never seen it visualized like that. The CDC does have a diagram, not an image of a doll. But what we need to realize here is that it is simple, it is visual. Those of us who love text don't understand that the internet is now entirely visual, and it makes you feel something. So when we think about communicating in 2025, the question is, how can we make things simple? How can we make things shareable? And how can we make people feel things without creating content like this, right? That is deliberately meant to be sensational and and is shocking. Like that shouldn't be the way that we respond. The question is, how do we move into the middle? And when we think about that, our information environment is splintered and participatory and networked, how do we work within those characteristics? We can't resist them. That is the information environment. And it's not just conspiracy theorists. It's the way that as humans, we are responding to information. It has shifted considerably, but too many of us who work for newsrooms and universities and government agencies still think, oh, we just need a 69-page PDF. And so, as you, I'm sure, know, this idea that you can reach anybody, whoever you are, that we all have a phone, which essentially is the equivalent of a publishing house. You'll now see language like this. This is from a Substack from a nationalist group, a white nationalist group, Europa Invicta. They say why we chose Substack. What we like most about Substack is that we can now communicate with you directly. No middleman platform, no algorithm, no haters, no censorship. Now we have complete access to and control over our ability to contact and engage with you, which means if the platforms disagree with our message or try to shut us down, we can still keep in touch with you and keep the momentum of our network going. It's important that you don't have to do people like me will study this, but we have to recognize that the absence of gatekeepers, the ability for people to create these communities where everybody can have a voice, everybody can feel heard, that has changed the ways in which our information environment has shifted. And what we see now is this idea that if content moderation is in place, that is censorship, right? And we've seen that argument work very, very effectively over the last 4 years, reframing the way people are thinking about information spaces. So just to close out this session, the most trusted messengers, and you know this, right? Consistent in their messaging. We know this, familiarity and repetition work. We know this from psychological research. Our human brains are, unfortunately, we get really overwhelmed. So if we've seen something a couple of times before, even if it's false and even if it's been fact checked, we tend to go, oh, and we revert back to that thing that we've heard multiple times, which is why I'm trying to repeat things to you today. Consistent messaging is what people are looking for, and your brains are more likely to remember what you hear multiple times. And disinformation actors are really good at understanding that. Secondly, trusted messengers are dependable as they're continuously present. We know this about influencers. They're doing it for money, but they are there every single day. They turn up every single day in your feed, right? And they're doing it for money. But what that means is people see that and see it as trustworthy because they're always there. They're dependable. And finally, this idea, authentically themselves. I mean, I, like you, detest this word authentic, but it's absolutely at the heart of so much effective communication. This idea of, well, they're talking to me now live from their living room whilst drinking a glass of wine. Like if you watch AOC do Instagram lives, people feel a sense of, oh, I can see her living room. Oh, she drinks the same wine as me, right? There's not this distance that you would normally have with a politician. There's this sense of, oh, she's just like me, right? And how do we do that as institutions where we often put these barriers up? Because that's partly how we have our authenticity is by being distanced. But unfortunately now the information environment is like, oh no, authenticity is about collapsing that distance. It's about using language like we and us. It's about using memes, being visual. And that's the big shift for so many of us working in these spaces. So people who are effective understand that everyone has an emotional relationship to information, not a rational one. If I go to the BBC today and I read a BBC story, I might go, oh, I am unlikely to share it because I'm unlikely to have an emotional reaction to that text. Whereas I'm more likely to share something that I have a visceral reaction to, whether that makes me angry, whether it makes me sad, whether it makes me frightened, whether it makes me think that I can buy something to solve a problem. Like if I haven't had a reaction to something, I'm less likely to do anything with it. And so what I say to people all the time is, how can you think about using emotion, but in a way that you feel okay with, right? I'm not asking you to put emotion into your work that you think is shocking or over the top, but how can you make people feel something? That's the key to so much of this. And as described, the challenge for organizations is that people now expect them to communicate in this way as well. So the ways that they see their best friends communicating on TikTok or their influencers on TikTok, they expect institutions to do the same. So this is the UN's TikTok account. This is one of their staff doing a TikTok live at a transit center receiving Afghans pushed back from Pakistan and Iran. And there she is doing an amazing job on TikTok. And I'm sure she's like, I didn't expect this when I started working at the UN, right? But there is now this belief that organizations and institutions need to be in these spaces where people are spending time. But for communications processes rooted in press releases and tightly controlled key messages, this is a very difficult transition because I'm sure there are a number of you being like, oh yeah, that's nice, lady with the funny accent. Have you been to my nonprofit? There's 3 of us. We've got no time. We've got hardly any money. And now you're telling me that I also have to be in all of these spaces? Not possible. Right. Or you might say, well, that's great, lady, but I actually work in an organization where everything has to get signed off by the CEO 2 days before the release. Like, how am I meant to do this? I can't just experiment. So the challenge here is how can organizations adapt to this moment And that has to be done at an individual level. But this is a real challenge for many organizations that like to keep their communications tightly controlled. Okay, so this isn't political, but I think this is an extraordinary case study. And I just wondered, and I'm going to stop share, whether anybody wants to either say something or put something to chat. But does anybody know what this image refers to and why I might want to talk about this image in the context of what I've just been sharing? Did anybody follow this? Is anybody from New York? Yes, so it's Mamdani. And what do you know? What did he do a couple of weekends ago? Yes, he did a scavenger hunt. Now, doesn't matter. I don't care what your politics are, what his politics are. As an example of communication in 2025, this was extraordinary. And it was extraordinary because it was participatory, because people felt like they were part of something, like a conspiracy, like QAnon. There were clues you had to follow. The idea was that you did it with friends. It connected online and off. It was it was unbelievable as a way of taking some of the elements of conspiratorial cultures and applying it to the kind of environments that we need to improve. So to me, when I think about how can we think about this, it was fun, it was playful. People felt connected in a way they hadn't done before. I saw people say, I started this scavenger hunt, but then I bumped into my best friend and we spent the rest of the afternoon in the park. Or I learned so much about New York politics. Or wow, I got my kid to go on a bike, which I haven't done before. I cycled 8 miles. I mean, on every level, that scavenger hunt did something extraordinary. And so what I say to people is, I couldn't have come up with that idea. Like it doesn't matter how much you study it. There's so much room for us to experiment right now, but we need to experiment without fear, which is very scary for people in senior management because we have this sense of like, well, this is our organization and we have to communicate like this. We have to, it's if I can control it, we'll be okay. And the truth is right now, we need to let go. And that's really, really hard. But we need to give agency to our communities to really take our messages and make them their own. Right. And that is part of creating participatory spaces like the scavenger hunt did. And of course, that was a big thing. And he's got lots of money, et cetera, et cetera. But the premise of that was not expensive. The premise was just how do we get people to feel part of something? So that I wanted to bring that in because I just thought it was such a beautiful example of understanding the fact that our information environment is splintered, networked, and participatory. On that day, many, 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 many people were talking about this across lots of different platforms. It wasn't you just had to follow him on Blue Sky. People were doing Instagram lives, they were on YouTube, they were on Blue Sky, they were on TikTok, they were on X. You know, he did something that combined and brought people together in a way that often people don't feel like they're together with other people because we live and spend time in a splintered environment. Okay, so I wondered if at this point anybody had any questions, comments, thoughts, or examples. And just to stress, because this is being recorded, I totally understand if somebody's got a question that they don't want to be recorded. But if you have a question that you think, actually, I bet somebody else is thinking this, and you think it would be generative, I would love to hear that. But a question, a concern, or, oh, I don't think so, or an example. I just want to make sure that I on to part two. Okay, so takeaways. We can't communicate like it's 1996. We have to remember that the web is a participatory space. It's very difficult to control a message, and it's much more effective to let people play with your message to make it their own. And we have to be where people are spending their time. Okay, part two. This gets a little bit darker. Bespoke realities and the weaponization of our information environment. So, 1 in 5 US adults say they turn to influencers to help them understand current events and civic issues. And so we have what are called news influencers, and these tend to be often people who curate news from mainstream platforms, but they are doing it in authentic, interesting ways. There's one called Under the Desk, and she reads the news under the desk. I mean, there's all sorts of different people who are taking information and sharing it. And we're finding that my students, they don't watch the news or consume the news, but they know everything that's happening when I ask them because of these kind of news influences, which is fascinating. But what we're seeing is that these influencers tend to be kind of much more aligned to different political ends of the spectrums. And so around these influencers, we have what Rene DeResta calls bespoke realities. So this was some research that was done in July, basically looking at the biggest political adjacent, as they describe them, YouTube channels by total subscribers. And you can see that there's some really big players on the right and the left. Actually, if you look at the numbers, you'll see that really those numbers suggest that it's much more to the right, but that we still have some very big players on the left. But what I want to point out here is to understand that some of those previous silos of news, sports, comedy, now we have many of these people who overlap in all of these places, right? That people listen to podcasters or watch these YouTube channels because they want to be entertained. And entertainment looks very, very different. It's either they want to laugh at a joke or they want to hear about what the other side politically is doing and to feel appalled. Like people want to feel something, right? And all of these influencers make you feel something. So this is a very different way of thinking about the world than if I had done this presentation in 1997 and I would have been like, here are the three mainstream news networks. There's a new upstart called Fox News and CNN is still doing, I mean, it's extraordinary how much things have changed in 30 years. The rise of podcasters, the way that podcasting has now really become visual because all podcasts now are on YouTube, like all of this has shifted things in a really extreme way in a very short space of time. And so this concept, bespoke realities, is a kind of an update to the term echo chambers, which you've, I'm sure, heard, which is this idea that we tend to spend time in spaces with other people who look or think similarly to us. And what she really emphasizes in her work is that it's not just echo chambers of left and right. She talks about bespoke realities can emerge around a number of issues and consists of an influencer who understands the contemporary information environment and knows how to A, manipulate the algorithms to maximize impact, and two, so that users create a participatory community around them that normalize discussions as the only reality. So I'm going to give you an example to kind of show how this works, which is to say, if you've got an influencer who really understands how to manipulate the algorithms to make money, then the people in that orbit end up not receiving any other information and start to believe that what they're hearing is the only reality. So I've got two recent examples from across the political spectrum. The first is Candace Owens and the Macrons, and I don't know if you've heard that one. We're going to talk a bit about that. And then we're going to talk about the rumors from a couple of weekends ago about President Trump. So this story, if you haven't heard, is the Macrons, the French president and his wife, sued Candace Owens, who is a very provocative right-wing podcaster and influencer, claiming defamation because Candace Owens was suggesting that Macron's wife was actually a man. And this came after two influencers in France actually made that claim. And so Candace Owens said, well, I was just copying what they said. But it's all disgusting. But what I want to stress is when you look at the ways that Candace Owens was using her platforms, you realize how these things come together. So this is her doing a live YouTube video. And if you haven't seen this before, you can actually turn on live chat if you're doing a live video. And then your commenters can actually pay money to ensure that their comments get seen. So the more shocking your claims, the bigger audiences you're going to get and the more lucrative it becomes. So I've blurred out some of the names, but you can see this is actually a British person, £9.99. So happy to see you in your own space, blah, 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 paying £10 to have their comment seen. It's kind of extraordinary. When I saw this happening, I couldn't believe the connection between these live chats and how much money was being made in those spaces. But as much as I'd want to dismiss this claim, what we saw was this whole kind of like many of these different right-wing influencers all repeating this claim, either repeating it to be like, oh, I'm just asking a question, but they were also juicing the algorithm by using these terms, which meant that the algorithm was producing, was amplifying more of this content. And so what should have been a completely baseless claim that got ignored, the algorithm was like, oh, there's something to it. And just more and more content was being amplified, which meant more influencers were creating it. And it just became this huge thing that it didn't need to be. And then the Macrons are in the process of suing Candace Owens. But it's just this kind of like really terrible but perfect example of these bespoke realities, which is one influencer understanding how to manipulate the algorithm, and then creating this whole participatory community of other influencers and audience members, where then that became the only reality. So again, this is kind of a worst case, but I'm showing it to you to show how some of these mechanisms work. And when we think about these kind of narratives, I use this like kind of this image of a growing plant, which is upsetting because these narratives are horrible. But I talk about what are the formation factors. So things like credibility transfer. If you trust the messenger, you're going to trust the message itself. So that person was like, "Oh my goodness, Candice, so great to see you. Here's £10. Thank you so much." Like nobody was really questioning what she was saying. It was that they trust her. Complexity avoidance on the other side. Simple explanations win over nuanced reality. Nobody wants facts. Nobody wants complexity. Nobody wants two sides. They want simple explanations too often in these spaces. And so the simpler the claim, the more it's rise. So then when I talk about nourishment factors, things like a compelling hook, memorable emotional factors provide substance. This had an emotional factor. On the other side, belief attraction, narratives that align with our worldview bypass critical thinking filters. Right? Unfortunately, this is very much the case for all of us. If you receive information that reinforces what you already think you know, you are much more likely to believe it. And that we're more likely to do that when we are tired, when we are overwhelmed. So if I put people into a kind of a laboratory setting and ask them whether or not something is true or false, humans are very, very good at figuring out what's true or false. We're terrible if I ask you to do it when you're standing in a coffee shop scrolling. You're terrible in the middle of the night when you can't sleep and you're scrolling. You're terrible when you're stressed, right? So all the ways that we are overwhelmed as humans right now means that we're very bad at using the critical thinking that many of us actually do have. And then finally, I talk about spread factors, things that, echo chambers, bespoke realities, like-minded groups reinforce and intensify beliefs. If you're with other people that are saying the same things, you feel good about yourself because, as we know, we love to be in the in group as opposed to the out group. And unfortunately, information barriers means for many people, because of things like paywalls, or because they don't have enough data access, or they simply don't even know where to go and get good information, people now have limited access to diverse sources, and so tend to see this, and because of algorithms, tend to see the same things coming up again and again, and are less likely to go looking for other perspectives. And so the second example obviously is very recent, and many of you may remember this. But a couple of weekends ago, there was a lot of chatter online about President Trump's health. And an example on the left is from Keith Edwards, who's actually a democracy enjoyer, a YouTuber. It's not from where his position, he's on the left. But what you see here is he's posting an image, this tweet that says seems bad. Well, if you're a supporter of Trump, oh my goodness, is Trump in hospital? But also, if you're on the left and not a fan of Donald Trump, there's a sense of like, oh my goodness, is he in hospital? And I don't know whether this was an AI generated image. Surely, obviously, it's not a true image. I suspect it was AI generated. But from that, there was just this flurry of speculation from all sorts of people about Donald Trump. And it became this participatory, have you seen this? Have you seen this image? Oh my goodness, are you a doctor? What do you think? I don't know if you were part of this, but it really went everywhere over that weekend, particularly on the left. And so the same thing, simple people spending time with other people who were saying the same things, algorithms realizing that people were clicking and engaging that content, so they were delivering more of it. People's critical thinking filters were going out the window because they wanted to believe that it was true. So a compelling hook, it had all of the same things. And so this is really just another example to say that this problem is a very human problem. But what we're seeing today is the speed at which the information environment can get captured by these types of narratives that can affect people because they want to be part of something, right? So remember the Mamdani example. This is when that participatory spirit is flipped on its head, and people were sending this to each other, being like, have you seen it? What do you think? Oh my goodness, da, 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 da. So which goes to show that people want to feel part of something, but it can often go wrong because we're not providing positive examples for this. And so I often say to people who say, well, don't we need more media literacy? And I say, well, yes, we need to teach people how to read headlines and other things. But what we need to do is to get everybody to understand our own confirmation biases. So I'll always say to people when they send me something like this, have you sought out clarifying evidence or contradictory opinion? Like, this is just one thing. Have you formed an opinion because others you trust feel the same? Have you made an assumption based on your existing beliefs? Are emotional factors clouding your judgment? Have you simplified something that perhaps is more complex? Personal third-hand experience. Who is your trusted source? So all of these things are critical for every single one of us to think through when we are navigating these information environments, because influencers who understand how algorithms work and understand how our human brains work are much, much, much better at taking advantage of all of these elements. And unfortunately, that is why we live in the environment that we do now, where these damaging narratives can circulate widely before people will shut them down. And so just to end this section, I think as you heard in the bio, I've spent a lot of time studying misinformation. But this is what I say now is I think we're focused on the wrong part of the problem, which is harmful information spreaders, disinformation agents. They're the loudest voices, they're professional manipulators. That's what we focus on. That's what too often the headline writers focus on. It's too often what conferences focus on. There's a lot of money that goes towards focusing on misinformation. And whilst we can try and inoculate people against that and talk about what those harmful spreaders are, like what I'm doing today is an example of inoculation. What I actually wished we realize is that if we say 20% of the information environment is kind of the armpit of the internet, it's where the bad information lies. I think it's always going to be there. We're never going to have an information environment with no bad information. It's human for us to gossip. It's human for us to have low quality information. But I actually think that 80% of the information environment we can clean up by making sure that we're really focused on people who are seeking quality information, right? So these people tend to be passive participants. They may only lurk online. They might not say anything, but they're actively searching for specific questions. They're looking for context. They're looking for clarity. They've got questions, but when they go looking for those questions, they can't find good answers because people at universities and newsrooms are busy creating 69-page PDFs and posting them to their website that nobody can find. Like, how can we really focus on that 80% by being where people are spending their time, listening to their questions and concerns, and giving them answers to their questions and concerns, rather than focusing on those bad actors, because we can't play whack-a-mole with those rumors. But how can we do a better job of teaching people to identify their confirmation biases, teach them quality information, seeking habits, and how can we make sure we're listening to them and we're helping them find their answers by participating with them in community? Okay, time to just stop and see if you've got any questions, thoughts, examples to share. And Tarana, the inoculation games, bad news and bad facts, is exactly that point. When you get people to play the troll, that is one of the most effective ways of getting them to understand what the processes are, and they tend to be better at spotting this information when you've put them in the role of the troll. Okay. Section 3, which again, this has got quite a lot of stuff in here. So this you will get this information afterwards, so don't worry too much about it. But I wanted to talk a little bit about ways your organization can prepare to more effectively communicate in the context of the contemporary information environment. So as we've discussed, what I talk to organizations about is like, can we move below? How can we think about your quality information seekers? And a lot of the work I talk about here is all about preparing. And so again, do not focus on this, but one of the things I say to organizations is, how can you map your quality information seekers? Who are they? And of course, it depends for all of you because you have different community groups, but vulnerable families, donors, religious minorities, medically vulnerable, community lead, like who are the people that you're trying to help get information, right? And then for each one of those, like what are some of the considerations you might want to think about? Like, where are they? Do you know who they are? Like donors, yes, they're on your mailing list. Do they speak other languages? What are their competing demands? Like, so the next layer, where do they find information? Where are they spending their time? What do they care about? Who do they trust? Best messaging formats, right? So the more that you can think about the different quality information seekers that are kind of in your orbit, And then for each of them, try and understand, okay, where would they be spending their time if I wanted to listen to them? Like, kind of what kind of questions might they have? Who are they trusting once I've got information I want to get to them? And what kind of messaging formats do they kind of spend most time with, or do they trust, right? So again, this is not black and white, and it depends entirely for who your organization is. But doing this kind of mapping exercise, maybe at an organizational retreat, or this isn't just about your traditional communication strategy, it's about thinking about the different people that you can help get information about what you do. And that's really what you're trying to do. And then you hear this all the time, which is how can you identify and build a network of trusted messengers? We saw during COVID that a lot of this work had not been done. And all of a sudden, like universities were like, oh my goodness, yeah, we just got to connect with community groups, or the health department was saying, we just got to connect with community groups. They did that. And then after COVID, they've just disappeared again, right? And so the key is how can you identify community leaders, trusted messengers, but how can you continue to have those relationships with them? And I say to organizations too, like who internally can really work with you, right? I do quite a lot of work with the International Red Cross, and the other day I was with them, and they were like, "Oh yeah, we have all these drivers. Like we never do any training with our drivers, but they're actually out in the community all the time." Right. So who can be trusted messengers that are internal to your organization? And then what are some of your external partners who you could really start working with if you're not already? And how can you be consistent in terms of those relationships? Because we don't know what might be coming down the pike. And then once you kind of have those trusted messengers, trying to create a map of what I call community allies, right? So this is, again, the types of things that you might want to do at a retreat, but really thinking about who are you closest with and then moving out through those circles. Like, are there people that you're like, well, we do put, maybe we contact them once a year. Maybe they're on our holiday card list, but we don't really talk to them much. Like, how can you really focus on maybe some people on your outer circles and try and bring them in? And so are there relationships that you could work to strengthen? And again, I really hear all of you that say, oh, we've got no money, we've got no time. Like this is really, really hard. But I do say to everybody, trying to do this work can make such a difference when you're trying to ensure that your work is really having as much impact as possible. And again, it's not going to happen overnight, but I think as an organization, really trying to map, identify, reach out, and then build strong relationships with as many different community allies as possible can make a real difference. And then I also think this is helpful. What I call the influence matrix is mapping groups or individuals in terms of how influential they are in the community versus kind of alignment, right? So things like local journalists, they might be pretty influential, but they're not obviously aligned with you because they're nonpartisan or they can't be seen to be activists. So thinking about those kind of power dynamics around like business owners, I often think are really critical in many, many communities. They might not be aligned with you, but as we saw with COVID, like local salon owners were really, really powerful in spreading quality information about COVID to their own communities, even though they wouldn't necessarily have said that they worked in public health. So I often think this is useful as well to try and understand both who has influence, but also how they might be aligned or not with you, to understand that you can still, it's still worth aligning with organizations that you might not necessarily have thought of, but they do have influence in your community. And this is an ugly slide, and I apologize. But what I call this is the 360-degree approach. Right? There's this idea that I still hear from people that, oh, whatever, misinformation, oh, we'll just debunk that, it's fine. And what I try and say to organizations that I work with is this is all about kind of combining reactive and proactive responses. It's about thinking online and offline. It's about thinking about all the different organizations you can collaborate with. It's about listening so that you can actually answer people's questions. It's about counter messaging. It's about running Q&As. It's about all of these different things, which is thinking about the information environment as a whole, not just thinking about messages. And too often organizations are just listening for bad messages that they can debunk, as opposed to how can I build and strengthen the bottom of that iceberg, knowing that it's not going to happen overnight, but this has to be a continuous part of our work. We have to be proactive, partly so that when something bad happens, we're in a stronger situation, but really because actually information environments, if we're proactive constantly, we are going to reach those quality information seekers and we are less likely to have bad information spreading about us. So I wondered if, and I'm a bit aware of time, so I'm not going to stop the slides here, but I'm just interested to think about if any of your organizations systematically listen to your communities. We've started having that conversation. Offline, online, what are you listening for? And lots of community groups talk about doing social listening. You may have heard the difference between monitoring versus listening. Monitoring is this kind of like scanning for signals, which is, as I said earlier, too many people using social listening dashboards, writing reports about, oh, the sentiment, people are happier with our organization this week than last week. I really advocate for properly listening in, like the idea of tuning in, and I really talk about hearing. So monitoring, scanning for signals, yes, important to look for emerging narratives and risks, doing this offline and online, tracking keywords and hashtags, mapping influencers, like all of this is important. But I don't think it's as important as really listening, which is understanding concerns and context, understanding how people are interpreting and feeling about different types of information, identifying emotional drivers and trust dynamics, really doing it to inform messaging tone and content. And this could be, we just talked that beautiful phrase about community bellwethers, really having community feedback meetings, open doors, local staff observations, local partner feedback, or really trying to think about polls and surveys online, insights from moderators and admins of relevant groups. What are people saying to you via direct messages and mentions? What are people saying in comment spaces about you? So I just wanted to stress that because I think there's a little bit too much emphasis in the kind of NGO world, and I say that who's somebody who's been in that, of these kind of high level reports where people feel like they're doing monitoring, but I really don't think they're listening to how the content is impacting communities. And that's why I really, really loved one of the first questions that we had today. So we're coming to the end now, but in order to navigate our contemporary information environment, I think it's critical to find ways to systematically listen to communities, both your own communities as well as others. And here are just some things to share. Because when you're listening, one thing I say to people and organizations is there's normally a relatively small number of known narratives that are shared around certain types of work or issues or topics. And so the more that you listen, you can predict and prepare for those narratives. So again, working with the ICRC, one of the biggest narratives is that they are actually funded by, international funders, that they're actually spy organizations. And so whilst their reports might show, 100 new YouTube clips a week, almost all of them are under that same narrative, which is that they can't be trusted because they're a spy organization, right? So by doing really good listening consistently, you start to realize that there tend to be a relatively small number of narratives. And once you know what those narratives are, you can inoculate people against them by being upfront. Like some people suggest that those of us that work in this space are blah, 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 or some people say blah, blah, blah. So it helps you by being informed by those narratives. Speculation leads to escalation. I think, I can't remember your name now, lovely, but you were talking about how people kind of use journalists. Well, lots of influencers were like, well, I don't know if there's anything to this. I'm just asking questions, right? And so when people are asking questions, we need to make sure that we are filling those information voids. So an example I use from the pandemic is, you might remember that people were concerned about myocarditis, which is a heart condition, and it was affecting young boys around the ages of 9 to 10. And people were suggesting that the vaccine was causing myocarditis in young boys. So you had many, 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 many people online saying, I don't know whether to vaccinate my son. Can somebody help me? I've heard the term myocarditis. I don't know what to do. Now, the CDC at that time didn't have enough data to answer the question. And because they did not come out and say anything, they just stayed silent. So we had a vacuum. And in that vacuum, conspiracy theorists filled that vacuum by informing anybody that would listen that myocarditis was a real problem. And that's why people shouldn't vaccinate their sons. And for 3 weeks, that really, really caused damage that continues to this day. So I use that all the time to say, Back in 1996, 97, we could say no comment. We could control the information environment. We can't do that anymore. So we have to fill information voids. We can't let vacuums sit because that's where bad information circulates. And so information voids are spaces online where we have vacuums, which is distinct from what individuals have, which is information gaps, which I sort of love this slide. But what I think I know, based on what I have been told by sources I trust, and what I want to know to advance or clarify my understanding of the topic I care about, there's often a blind spot in the middle, which is actually what I need to know. And so we, particularly around policies, people tend to have very high information gaps. And one of my examples was from the Missouri presidential election in November of last year. I don't know if you remember, maybe some of you are from Missouri, but the state voted for Donald Trump and voted for Republican candidates, but then they changed on some ballot proposals. They raised the minimum wage, they overturned the ban on abortion, and they passed family medical leave. And when I heard an NPR interview, they talked about a guy was knocking on doors, and every time somebody opened the door, they'd be like, do you want to support the raising of the minimum wage? And people are like, no, people get paid too much. I'm like, well, how much do you think they get paid? I don't know, $3,000, $4,000. Well, no, actually, it's less than 2,000. Oh my God, less than 2,000. Of course, I would support it. Right. And so what we know from the research is around policies, people tend to have very low information. And if you can fill and emphasize or fill those information gaps, we tend to have more nuanced policy discussions, and people are less likely to fall back on those heuristic cues, those mental shortcuts that tend to be around partisanship. So I talk all the time with organizations like, what are the information gaps people might have about your organization or about the issue that you're working towards? So, and one thing I quickly say is remember all the places that people could get information around that blind spot. And if you were to audit those spaces, like asking ChatGPT, what answers would people get? Because this needs to be part of your listening processes, is you're not just listening to what people are saying, you need to listen and audit to the places that they might be getting the information from, so that you can create content to make sure you're filling those. And finally, again, we're running out of time, but there are many, many types of mitigating action: pre-bunking, meeting privately with people, correcting the record, a whole host of things in terms of mitigating actions. Again, these slides are available, but be flexible, be participatory, be accessible, be memorable, be prepared. That takes us back to the beginning of the presentation for best practices. And I'll end here around the information supply chain. Reactive communication is how we think about crisis communications: debunking, issuing statements, placing op-eds, but that's all at the end of the information supply chain. We need to move our thinking to the front of the information supply chain for proactive communication, to map narratives, identify, build ongoing relationships with trusted messengers, fill information voids, pre-bunk, be in spaces where we want to reach people all the time in authentic ways. And if we did that, we wouldn't have as much of a problem at the top of the iceberg. So thank you very much for your time. This was a longer webinar, but I hope that there was something here that was at least useful to you.
Thank you. Thank you all so much for joining us today and for engaging so thoughtfully in this conversation. A big thank you to Dr. Wardle for sharing her expertise and insights with us. And another special thanks to our partners at Witty Gritty for helping us with today's event. I hope you're leaving with new perspectives and tools that you can take back into your work. We'll be sending a follow-up email with the presentation, resources, and today's recording, so keep an eye out for that. Before I close out, I have two things. I will have a survey, a link, and QR code in the chat that I would love to get your feedback, which is incredibly valuable to the work that we do, understanding how our current offerings are helping, and then it helps shape what we plan for the future. So if you could take a moment to complete that. And then I also have a few upcoming learning sessions that I would like to share with you. So thank you so much for posting the QR code. Just a few upcoming learning sessions to share for our Delta partners: Storytelling After Delta, Inspiring Support for Wardle Leadership is happening tomorrow, Thursday, September 11th from 2 to 4. If you're a Delta partner and haven't received a link yet, but would like to join, please reach out to Meredith Malloy. For all of our partners, the next part of our communication series, Crises Communication 101, Crisis Communication 101, Managing Issues and Crises When You're Feeling the Pressure with Defy Communications, will be held on Tuesday, October 14th from 2 to 3:30. Also, for all of our partners, our fully interactive virtual convening Positive Progress Collaborations Across Complexity in Animal Advocacy will take place on October 21st to the 23rd. There are 3 half days from 12 to 4:30. You can register using the link in the chat. And then lastly, please hold and mark your calendars for December 10th and 11th after 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time for our end of the year event. We'll be announcing our featured speaker very soon. Thanks again to everyone, and we look forward to seeing you at an upcoming session. Have a wonderful rest of the day. If you haven't had a chat, please click on that link so you can take our survey or scan the QR code and then also our registration links. Thank you, everyone.